Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tinellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and enjoy. Karen Herbert is a Perth-based author whose debut crime novel, The River Mouth, was recently released by Fremantle Press. Incredibly, Karen began writing this book the day after she was made redundant from her job. 18 months later, she had 2 books under contract, one of which was The River Mouth, a haunting, exceptionally well-written novel which centres on the shooting death of 15-year-old Darren Davies and his mother's struggle to come to terms with his death when, after 10 years, new DNA evidence gives investigators a new lead on the killer. Listeners, this book has everything we love in a crime novel, examining complexities of life in a small town set against a backdrop of violence, secrets and criminal activity. A stunning debut novel that had me guessing till the very end. And I'm so very delighted to welcome Karen to talk about this book on the podcast today. Hi, Karen.
Hello, Claudine. Thank you very much for having me. I'm over here in Wajak Noongar country, where it's looking a little bit cloudy, but I'm told it's not going to rain.
Well, I'm so glad to be speaking with you. And wow, what a novel this was. Congratulations. You must be so incredibly pleased to see it out on the shelves.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for your lovely words in introducing the book. It really is quite a thing, isn't it, to have a book published and unexpectedly, after not being a serious writer until very, very recently, it's just it's so special seeing it on shelves and getting messages from people who've read the book and told me how much they like it. It's just a lovely, lovely thing.
Oh, that's so wonderful. Now, from what I've been able to gather, Karen, you've had a fairly eclectic working life, and I understand that you've got experience in aged care, disability services, Indigenous land management, along with social housing. And I can see that these experiences have found their way onto the pages of this book. So with that in mind, I wanted to ask you, did you always want to be a writer?
When I was a very little girl, and I was reminded about this just the other day when I was cleaning out a cupboard. I could write. That was the thing that I could do. I found merit awards from when I was 7 from writing poems. I can't write poetry now. I'm useless at it. But, you know, being a writer is, well, for a little girl in the 70s in the Midwest of Western Australia in a country town, it wasn't something that I could visualise. It wasn't, what do writers do? How do they live? I couldn't see that. I couldn't understand it. So it wasn't something that I aspired to be. I actually did a year of journalism when I came down to university, and I was so appallingly bad at it that I transferred out and did a very generic sort of business degree, which I loved, certainly not knocking my business degree. But no, it wasn't something that I thought I could do. So I kind of put it aside. And I did scribble from time to time when my kids were little and I was working. But, you know, you're raising a family, you've got a career. When I did get time to write, I'm afraid it was rubbish. So I didn't take it any further until I had the headspace and the time.
So when you sat down to write The River Mouth, did you always know it was going to be a crime novel?
No, I didn't. I started writing the scene that became chapter 4, the scene where the boys are messing about on the riverbank. They're swinging from a rope swing. They're doing bommies. They're giving each other a hard time. And as I wrote it, I could see the dynamic between the boys emerge. And I could see the way I had written the scene, which is a very sort of enclosed, unobserved, wild kind of place, the kind of place we go to when we're kids and we want to be away from adults and test out our limits.
Yeah.
And I thought, these kids' lives, they didn't turn out the way they would have liked. Something bad happened. And I wanted to know what that was. And I knew that what that was very deeply embedded in the community. And I knew I was looking at a crime story, but I didn't quite know what. So I wrote to explore that.
Bearing that in mind, can you tell me what the spark of inspiration was for the river mouth?
Oh, yes. Well, the place where the boys were playing was the place that was very familiar to me. That's the stretch of water on the Chapman River between Highway 1 and the old bridge there and the beach where we used to swim as kids. And me and my sisters, we were absolutely not allowed to go down to the river. We were not allowed to go past the end of our street. We were not allowed to cross Swan Drive. It was a place where there were people who lingered, and there were snakes and there were spiders, and there were submerged rocks in the water. And so, of course, we went there because,
That's what you do.
That's what we do. And it was very easy, I found, to paint that setting from memory.
So in terms of the actual story, was there an event that sparked this particular story, or did it more emerge from that scene that you told us about earlier?
No, it very much emerged from that scene. There was no event. All the events in the book except one, which my sister called me about when she read it. She wasn't happy. They're all made up. It's all entirely fiction.
Okay. Can you tell me more about the story?
The story emerges with two narrators in two different time frames. So it starts with Darren's mother, the boy that was shot, and it's 10 years on from his death, and she receives a visit from the police, and they tell her that her best friend has died. So she's, this is another blow for her. And she's a woman who is already tired, still grieving, still managing her life, but still getting up every day and doing it. And they tell her, Sandra, that her best friend Barbara has died on a remote Pilbara road. And then they tell her that the DNA that they've taken from Barbara's body matches the DNA that was scraped from under her dead son's fingernails. And this opens up the investigation again. And it also makes Sandra start to question what she knew about her best friend, what she knew about other people in the community. She wonders what they knew. And she also wonders about Darren and Darren's final weeks. And that's where we come to the other narrator, who is Darren's best friend, but also Barbara's son. And Colin tells us the story of those last few weeks, interspersed with Sandra's story. So we see the boys being boys, exploring, going to school, getting into fights with each other, feeling embarrassed when girls walk past them as they're waiting for the bus. And I tried to build a picture of what these children's lives were like, unobserved by their parents.
Now, we talked a little bit about the setting of this book, but I felt it was really rather unique. It was on the river and on the ocean, and both of those bodies of water were second nature to the kids who lived there. And I understand it is fictional, but as you said, based on a place that you know. So why there? What was it about this landscape that drew you to write about it?
I studied psychology in the end as part of my business degree, and then I did a master's in applied psychology. And one of the concepts in psychology is a concept called place attachment. Place attachment, it varies between people. Some of us have strong place attachment and some of us don't. And the places that we are attached to, unsurprisingly, are places where we have a deep psychological connection because maybe something important happened to us there, or maybe there are myths, creation myths, for example, that are associated with a particular landform, or maybe the place is a source of food or shelter for someone. And for me, that area around the river and the sea is a place where I roamed with my sisters, where we grew and we developed and we learned how to interact with each other. We learned how to test our physical boundaries in the water. We learned how to keep ourselves safe out of our parents' sight. So for me, that place is very strong. It has a very strong pull. And when I go back to Geraldton to visit my family, which is the setting for Weymouth, I say I'm going home And I haven't lived there for over 30 years.
As I said earlier, I can see your life's work reflected in some of the themes of this book. For example, the people who live with disability, the homelessness, the care of older people, amongst other things. Did you consciously set out to explore these issues, and why?
Absolutely, I did. I got up on my soapbox, Claudine. Those things are really important to me. I think even more important in writing this book, though, was I knew the story was really deeply embedded in the community. Mm-hmm. I wanted to show that community as it is. And I wanted to show all of the people that we have in a community. We have people with disability, we have older people, we have people who don't have great means, we have people who are homeless. And often in fiction, those people are invisible. We don't see them. And I wanted to see them. I wanted to show them there, to say, look, these are the lives that are being lived around us. See them, and know them as whole people. Don't just know them as Darren, the boy with the disability, or Arthur, the homeless man. Let's hear their stories, see all of the things that make them human beings, their humour, their empathy, their little grizzles in life. See them as humans.
Suffice it to say that there are some fairly dark undercurrents in this story, particularly of sexual violence against women, and it forms one of the important motive threads in the seemingly senseless murder. So tell me about that and why it was important to this story.
Sexual violence against women is there. It's part of our society, just like we have a variety of people in our society. I think it's important to acknowledge it, to include it in our stories when that makes sense, but not to include it in a way that is gratuitous or gives us entertainment. Mm. It was important to me to include those things because I knew they were there, but it was also important for me to not talk about the physical horror of those things and describe that in detail, but more to create space where we could look at the fallout of those events and how it impacts on people's relationships and how people make sense of them and continue on afterwards.
We talked a little bit about the structure of this novel and the way and the two different points of view. I found that really fascinating. As you said, the story is told from Darren's mother's point of view in the present, and then Colin, Darren's friend, in the lead up to Darren's death. Was this a conscious decision on your part to structure it this way, or did it more come about as you were writing?
It did come about as I was writing, but I worked out fairly early on that that's what I needed. I needed the two narrators. I wanted to show the events from the perspective of an older person who was dealing with it in particular ways as a mother, as a carer, as a responsible person in the community. But I also wanted to show it from the perspective of the children. And I wanted to show some of those issues that I raised in the book from the perspective of the children as well, because it seems to me that kids do react to difference in a very different way to adults. So if give you an example, maybe Tim and Colin, when they interact with Darren, they don't interact with him as a person with a disability. They interact with him in all the multitudes of his characteristics. Darren's a bit naughty. He's a bit short, flies off the handle sometimes, but he's also a good friend and a loyal friend. And he does fun stuff. He's got a boat. They can go out and boat with him. That's good fun. And that's how they react to Darren. But these boys are maturing now and they're starting to understand more complicated concepts. They're starting to learn that society puts people in groups. And we see a scene, an argument between Tim and Darren, where Tim reveals that understanding that he's now developing. And I wanted to show the impact of that on Darren and on the group and on Tim.
I think one of the things that hit home for me about this book, and something I felt Sandra was shocked to the core about, was, and it was something you touched on a little bit earlier, was how little she knew about not only her son, but her husband. I suspect that she would have said that they were a close family. They were a close-knit family. She always knew where her son was, and yet in the aftermath of his death, it turns out she knew very little. It was quite confronting as a parent of 3 children, a teenage daughter. No matter how well you parent, no matter how hard you try to keep your kids safe, there are still things about their lives that you will never know. Tell me a little bit about that.
So interesting that you say that. You see, for me, and I suppose that highlights how different we all are as parents and how different our parenting styles are. Because for me, it was always apparent, and it really was, I don't use that word flippantly, right from the start, that my little babies and then my toddlers and then my children, they were themselves. They were self-contained in themselves, and I could only see what I could see. And it used to shock me sometimes when people would say, oh yes, but when your child is lying because you're the mother. And I'd look at them and go, actually, I don't. I really don't. It's not apparent to me at all. And I think that for me is one of the wonderful things about being a mother, is that I'm constantly unpacking these children. Every year they change. Every year they decide what they will reveal to me and what they won't reveal to me. And that's just absolutely delightful. My best friend is completely different. She seems to know her children very, very well. And she has a very different parenting style to me. And we often look at each other and we say, how is it that we've known each other since we were 12, grew up in the same town, same age, and yet we are such different parents with different expectations of what we will know and what we will accept that we know about our children. So that's interesting that you should say that about yourself and your own reaction to that part of the book. Maybe that's something that I revealed about myself that I didn't think I was doing.
Indeed. You mentioned your best friend and the fact that you grew up in the same town and have known each other all your life. I grew up in the same household as my sister, and we have completely different parenting styles.
And do you look at each other sometimes, I don't know, maybe at Christmas when one of you is telling your children not to do something or to do something, and you look at your sister and just go, why are you doing it like that?
I don't know that I look at her that way. I think she's probably looking at me and going, you're a bit tough. Okay, moving along. I thought Barbara was a really interesting and perhaps troubled character. Now, Barbara is Sandra's best friend and Colin's mum. She's obviously suffering trauma from being one of the stolen generation, one of the children stolen from her family. It's not a central theme, but I feel that it influenced her parenting style. Do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. Barbara was difficult to write, although not initially. Initially, I could see and hear and feel Barbara. I knew who she was. And when I started to write her, it just flowed really nicely. But then I second guessed that and thought, oh, hang on. I need to be careful here that I don't assume that aspects of a story that I don't know about. I must be careful that I only talk about what I know and be very clear whose eyes I'm seeing this through. So we see Barbara through Colin's eyes and we see her through Sandra's eyes. And her story is told by Sandra, but she does it in a very circumspect way. And she does it in a way that I tried to use my own understanding of the trauma associated with those events and make it clear that this was only my understanding. I wasn't speaking for anybody who had experienced that. It's a bit of a difficult line to walk. I don't know if I did it well. I don't know if it will age well. I had a conversation in the book between Barbara's husband and Sandra about Barbara's death. where they are trying to make sense of it. And look, in the end, they are two ordinary white people, middle class, working class, ordinary white people, grappling with these concepts. And they do it in ways that are a little bit cliched sometimes. And I wrote that conversation very fast. I could hear it in my head. There were things that I'd heard people say. And then I came back and reread it and thought about it for a long time, about the appropriateness of putting that in there. But then I thought, this is what people say. This is how people come to an understanding about things they don't know very much about. And it needs to be okay that we fumble and stumble a bit on the way to doing that. And I thought, no, I'll leave it in there and I'll allow them to fumble and stumble, because that just is what it is. That is how we get there. There's no point really hiding it and making them emerge fully formed with a perfect understanding.
Yeah. So I can hear that you did have, a bit of concern about writing an Indigenous character. I mean, Barbara's not the only Indigenous character in this book, but, I can see that, obviously you didn't write from her point of view as such. There were difficulties associated with that for you. But in terms of her parenting style, I could see that Barbara wanted to be the kind of parent that she imagined she could be or wanted to be to Colin. But, there were things that she didn't know about Colin as well.
No, there were things that she didn't know about Colin. And look, Barbara's a social worker. She's a lefty from the start. She knows all the right things to do, but she's also a very loving, intuitive woman. And I tried to show that in the interactions between her and her son in their kitchen. Yes, she didn't know. Well, she wouldn't know. She wouldn't know everything a teenage son gets up to, would she?
So let's talk about The Rivermouth has been optioned to be made into a film, right?
Well, yes, film or
Very
television.
exciting.
Yeah. So look, this is another thing that I'm learning as being a debut author. I'm learning how to talk to people like you and talk about my book. And I'm finding as I talk about my book, I'm discovering more things about it.
Yeah.
The lovely people at Sparkplug Films in Victoria read The Rivermouth, and they asked if they could have an option on it, a film and television option. So I've learned all about how film and television options work in the last few months. And that's really, really exciting, isn't it? Hey, to have these characters sitting on a bookshelf in people's homes and in shops, and now potentially maybe on a screen in people's lounge rooms or in a cinema. I'm pinching myself. I've got bruises everywhere. It's just such a lovely thing. And Sparkplug Films have been associated with some great Aussie movies. I watched their version of King Lear with Hugo Weaving a couple of months ago and was just blown away by how well they did that. Just loved it. So, got my fingers and toes crossed that can all come together.
Indeed. Well, I cross my fingers and toes for you too, because I think that would be incredibly exciting to be able to see this story come to life on the screen. Karen, if there was one thing that you would like readers to take away from this novel, what would it be?
There was one thing I would like them to take away, is that they had a few hours outside of their lives reading a crime story that entertained them, that they enjoyed, and maybe gave them a few things to think about.
Karen, you might know that there are a lot of aspiring authors that listen to this podcast. And so I usually ask people, particularly given your experiences in the publishing arena at this stage, if you've got any tips or tricks that you can pass on to listeners.
Oh, goodness. I'm such a pretender. It doesn't feel right for me to offer people advice. But if I sort of look back at my own life and how I've come to writing, and some of the authors, particularly the younger authors that I get to meet with a lot these days, I would say if you are struggling to find time to write, to find the brain space to write, but you're also juggling a family and a career, paying off your mortgage, life is long. I'm 53. I've just published my first book. I only really started writing a couple of years ago. There is lots of time to do this stuff. And honestly, I think if you are in the thick of life, and it is thick in our 20s and 30s, there's so much that we have going on. And it's wonderful stuff. It's great fun. If you're there and you're writing, I think, wow, you're great. You're amazing for even finding the time to put pen to paper. But if you can't, and if you can't get that manuscript finished because you've got so much going on, don't fret. There's lots of time to do it.
I think it's so true. Beat yourself up when you're young, you're trying to do everything and be all things to all people at the same time.
Yeah.
And you're right, life is long, and there's plenty of time to get that going. So there's hope for us yet.
There is, absolutely.
How wonderful. Okay, Karen, so if listeners wanted to connect with you, how can they do that?
They can go to my website, or they can just Google me, Karen Herbert.
And you're on Instagram and you're on Facebook? Yeah?
I'm on Instagram and I'm on Facebook and I'm on Twitter. I'll give you a little tip for finding me, though, if it's hard to search, is that Herbert is not my full name. My full name is Whittle Herbert, as in whittling wood with a hyphen and then a Herbert.
Karen, The River Mouth was a rich, compelling, quintessentially Australian novel. Once more, congratulations on a wonderful debut, and thank you so very much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage, claudinetинellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.